The old man across the room stopped mid-sentence the moment he saw the watch in my hand. He was talking to someone else entirely, laughing about something, and then he simply wasn't anymore. His eyes locked onto what I was holding, and the color left his face like someone had pulled a drain. He crossed the room without excusing himself. "Where did you get that?" he asked. His voice was quiet, but his hands were trembling. "It belonged to my grandfather," I told him. "He passed away 6 weeks ago." The man stared at the watch for a long moment. Then he looked up at me, and what I saw in his eyes wasn't curiosity. It wasn't nostalgia. It was something closer to fear mixed with a grief so old it had calcified into something else entirely. "We need to sit down," he said. "There are things you don't know." That was the moment I understood that my grandfather, the man my own mother had called a disappointment for most of my life, had been someone I never knew at all. My grandfather, Walter Crane, lived in a small rented house in Cookeville, Tennessee, the kind of town where the hardware store has been open since 1954 and everybody still waves from their front porch. He drove a truck with a cracked windshield he never bothered to fix. He grew tomatoes in the backyard. He watched baseball games with the volume too loud because he said his ears weren't what they used to be. On Sundays he made biscuits from scratch, using a recipe he claimed he'd learned from nobody, which my mother always said was just another one of his ways of keeping things to himself. He was the quietest man I have ever known. Not shy, not unfriendly, just quiet in the way that certain people are quiet, like they have made a deliberate decision about what to carry inside and what to let out. My mother never understood him. Her relationship with her father had been one long, slow withdrawal. The kind that doesn't announce itself as estrangement until one day you realize that the Christmas cards stopped years ago and neither of you noticed. She called him stubborn. She called him emotionally unavailable. She called him someone who had never figured out how to be part of a family. These were things she said at the dinner table, casually, the way you talk about weather patterns or traffic. My father was worse in a quieter way. He simply had no opinion of my grandfather at all, which I eventually understood was its own kind of cruelty. When my grandfather's name came up, my father would glance at his phone or refill his coffee, performing disinterest so completely that it became its own statement. My younger brother took their lead. He saw my grandfather maybe 3 times after I left for college. He once told me he didn't see the point of spending a whole Sunday driving to Cookeville to sit on a porch with someone who wouldn't talk. I was the only one who kept going back. I couldn't tell you exactly why, even now. Part of it was stubbornness. Part of it was something I felt when I sat beside my grandfather on that porch, something I could never quite name. He wasn't entertaining. He didn't tell stories. He didn't give advice unless you asked directly, and even then he was brief. But there was a stillness to him that I found myself returning to. The way you return to a certain chair in a house, because it's the one place you feel like yourself. He was the one who taught me to change my own oil, who mailed me handwritten letters during my first year working in Nashville because I'd mentioned offhand that I missed getting mail. He showed up once, without calling ahead. When I was going through a bad breakup, sat with me for 3 hours while I cried, didn't say much of anything, made soup, and drove back home. My mother never knew he'd come. When he got sick, it happened quickly. Pancreatic cancer, the kind that doesn't give you time to negotiate. By the time the diagnosis landed, the window had already narrowed. I drove to Cookeville the same day I found out and didn't leave for 2 weeks. My mother called twice. My father sent a fruit basket. My brother texted, "Let me know how it goes." My grandfather didn't complain about any of it. He sat in his recliner watching baseball with the volume too loud and told me I didn't have to stay if I had things to take care of. I told him I didn't. He nodded and handed me a biscuit. He passed away on a Tuesday morning in early March, with the birds loud outside the window and the television off for once, which I think was the way he wanted it. I held his hand. There was nobody else there. The funeral was small. A pastor who hadn't known him personally, a few neighbors from the street, a woman from his church who brought pound cake and cried more than anyone else in the room. My parents flew in for the service and flew out the same evening. My mother hugged me at the airport and said, "At least he's at peace now." My father said nothing, which by then I had stopped expecting him to. Afterward, I stayed behind to go through his things. Most of it was ordinary. Old clothes, work boots, a shelf of Louis L'Amour novels, fishing gear, a box of VHS tapes, tools organized with a precision that felt almost military. I packed what I could donate and set aside the rest. In the back of his bedroom closet, on the highest shelf behind a folded blanket, I found a shoebox held shut with a rubber band that had gone brittle with age. Inside was a small collection of things. A photograph of a group of young men in jungle fatigues, no caption, no date, a folded piece of paper I didn't open right away, and a pocket watch. The watch was silver, heavier than it looked. Old-fashioned, the kind with a cover that snapped open. The face was simple, but when I turned it over, the back had been engraved with a symbol I didn't recognize. Not a name, not initials. Just a specific, deliberate marking that looked almost like a compass rose but wasn't, like whoever made it had started with that idea and then changed their mind about what it should mean. I remembered my grandfather taking that watch out of his pocket sometimes when he thought no one was looking. Not to check the time, just to hold it for a moment, turn it over once, put it back. When I'd asked about it once as a teenager, he'd said it was just an old watch. I had accepted that because he said it in a tone that meant he was done with the subject. I kept it. I kept the photograph and the folded paper, too. I wasn't ready to open the letter yet. Something told me I needed to be somewhere steady when I did. My parents had asked me to handle the estate, which in practice meant deciding what to do with a rented house full of modest things that nobody in my family wanted. My mother suggested donating everything. My father suggested calling a service that would clear it all out for a flat fee. My brother suggested nothing because he didn't respond to the group text. I spent a week in that house, sorting through 80 years of a man's life alone. It was the loneliest I have ever been. I was back in Nashville when I got the invitation. A veterans' history exhibit was opening at a museum about an hour away, one of those regional events that tries to preserve the stories of men and women from the area who had served. A colleague had gotten me on the list. I wasn't going to go. And then I thought about the watch sitting in my apartment and I changed my mind. I didn't know what I was looking for exactly. I only knew that something about my grandfather's quiet life had started pulling at me in a way I couldn't ignore. I wore a blazer and carried my bag and put the watch in my jacket pocket because I'd gotten into the habit of carrying it the same way he had. The exhibit was crowded in the pleasant, low-key way of local events, older couples moving slowly through display cases, veterans wearing ball caps with unit insignias, volunteers in lanyards offering to answer questions. I walked through the photographs and the artifacts, reading the plaques, feeling the specific weight of other people's history. I was standing near a display of Vietnam-era equipment when I noticed him. He was tall, in his 70s, with close-cut white hair and a posture that some people carry for the rest of their lives after spending years standing at attention. He was deep in conversation with a younger man in a museum polo, talking about something in a glass case. He looked like someone who had long since stopped needing other people's attention and was simply at ease with where he stood in the world. I wasn't planning to approach him. I had taken the watch out of my pocket to look at it, comparing it to some of the objects in the nearby case. That was when he stopped talking. He turned slowly, the way someone does when they're certain of what they've seen before they fully commit to seeing it. His eyes went to my hand. Not my face. Not anything else. Just the watch. He said something brief to the man he'd been speaking with and walked toward me. "Excuse me," he said. His voice was even. "Practiced. That watch." "Yes," I said. "It belonged to my grandfather." He looked at it for a long moment without speaking. Then, quietly, "What was his name?" "Walter Crane," I told him. "He passed away recently. He was from Cookville." Something moved across the older man's face that I can only describe as recognition, arriving at the same time as sorrow, the way two fronts of weather sometimes collide. He exhaled slowly through his nose. "Is there somewhere we can talk?" he asked. We found a quiet room off the main gallery. 2 folding chairs and a table with a water pitcher nobody had touched. He sat across from me and was quiet for a moment, and I got the sense he was deciding not how much to tell me, but where to begin. His name was Colonel Raymond Aldrich, retired. He had served in the Army for 31 years, he said, with the last portion of his career spent in assignments that didn't appear in the kind of records families received at discharge. He told me that my grandfather had not been simply a soldier. Walter Crane had been recruited in the late 1960s for a unit that operated under a classification that still limited what Colonel Aldrich could say directly. They ran insertion missions in Southeast Asia, and later in areas that were never acknowledged publicly. Their mandate was intelligence extraction. which meant going into places that officially no American military presence existed, retrieving people or information, and leaving without a trace. No support structure, no record of deployment, no commendations. If something went wrong, the men in that unit were on their own, and the paperwork would say they were somewhere else entirely. Your grandfather was good at it, the colonel said. He was the best at being invisible. I looked down at the watch in my hands. The watch, the colonel said carefully. The symbol on the back, that's an internal marker. It identified members of the unit to each other in the field, without using names or ranks. Most of those watches were collected after the program was closed. I don't know how Walter kept his. I thought of my grandfather taking it out of his pocket when he thought no one was watching, not checking the time, just holding it. He knows what it cost him, I thought. He was just reminding himself what it was for. My mother's voice came back to me then, casual and dismissive at some long-ago dinner table. Your grandfather always acted like he had all these big secrets, like he was somebody important. It was exhausting. I could not speak for a moment. My family thought he was just difficult, I finally said. Private to the point of being absent. My mother spent most of her life thinking he didn't know how to care about people. The colonel nodded slowly, and his expression carried something that wasn't quite sympathy. It was something older and more tired than that. The men in that unit were not allowed to explain themselves, he said. Not to spouses, not to children, not to anyone. That was the agreement they made. Some of them found a way to live with it. Some didn't. He lived alone, I said. For the last 15 years. The colonel looked at his hands. I know, he said. I tried to reach out a few times over the years. He always kept it short. I think he'd made a decision about how he wanted to end things. Quietly. The same way he'd lived. I left the exhibit with the colonel's card and more questions than I'd walked in with. On the drive home, I pulled over twice because I couldn't trust my vision. Not because I was crying, exactly. It was something different. The feeling of a world reorganizing itself into a shape you don't recognize. That night, I finally opened the folded paper from the shoebox. The handwriting was careful and unhurried. The handwriting of someone who thought before they wrote anything down. If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you were the one who cared enough to look. I know who that will be. There are parts of my life I was never allowed to explain. Not to your mother, not to anyone. That was the agreement I made a long time ago, and I kept it because I believed in what I agreed to. I still do. I want you to understand one thing. I was never absent because I didn't love your mother. I was absent because loving her meant protecting her from things I couldn't put into words without putting her at risk. I know she didn't understand that. I know she thought it was something wrong with me. I hope someday she can see it differently. The watch means I existed. Keep it. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time with that letter in my hands. Outside the window, the city was doing what cities do at night. Indifferent and bright. But I felt very far from all of it. I thought about every Christmas my grandfather had spent alone because my mother said it was too much of a drive. Every birthday call that lasted 4 minutes. Every time my father had sighed when my grandfather's name came up, like the man's existence was a scheduling inconvenience. And I thought about my grandfather sitting in that recliner with the television too loud, growing tomatoes in the backyard, writing me letters in careful handwriting, showing up when I needed him without ever asking for anything in return, carrying everything he carried and carrying it alone. I called my mother the next morning. She listened without interrupting, which was unusual. I told her about the colonel, about the watch, about the unit, about what the marker on the back meant. I told her about the letter. There was a long silence after I finished. That can't be right, she said finally. Mom, I said, he was just private. That's what private people do. They make it sound like there was a reason. Her voice had that careful quality it got when she was managing something she didn't want to feel. He could have been more present if he'd chosen to be. Plenty of veterans are present. I told her I was going to meet with the colonel again. I told her I thought she should come. She said she would think about it. My father's reaction, when I called him that evening, was almost identical. He didn't dismiss me the way my mother did. He just got very quiet, and then he said he didn't see what it changed about anything, and then he got off the phone faster than the conversation warranted. My brother read my long text and sent back a thumbs-up emoji, which told me everything I needed to know about where he was. I met with Colonel Aldrich a second time, in a small office at a Veteran Services Center. He had made some calls, he said. There were documents, partially declassified, that confirmed what he'd described. He spread them on the table carefully, pages with black bars through the sensitive portions, but enough remaining to see the outline of things. Mission reports with no names attached, personnel lists with redacted entries where certain records had been formally removed, and in one corner of one page, a reference number that the colonel said corresponded to my grandfather's clearance designation. He went in 14 times, the colonel said quietly. 14 operational insertions in areas with no official U.S. presence. He brought back 3 intelligence assets who are still alive. He documented troop movements that changed tactical decisions at command level. None of it carries his name. None of it, I said. That was the cost, he said. They knew it going in. Your grandfather knew it. I think he was at peace with it. What he wasn't at peace with, I believe, was the personal cost, the part he couldn't control. I thought about what it would feel like to spend your whole life watching your own family dismiss you, knowing you couldn't defend yourself, knowing the defense would cost something more important than your own reputation. He paid for it, I thought. Every holiday he spent alone, every time my mother rolled her eyes, every time my father changed the subject. He paid for it quietly and without complaint, because that was the agreement he had made, and he was a man who kept his agreements. I asked the colonel if he had known my grandfather personally, beyond the unit. We were in the field together twice, he said. He was the kind of man you trusted completely and immediately. Not because he talked a good game, because you could feel that he meant every single thing he said. He paused. He was also extraordinarily funny when he wanted to be. People forget that about quiet men. They think the quiet means there's nothing there. That made me laugh, which I hadn't expected. He used to do this thing, I said. When someone was being dramatic at the dinner table, he'd just wait until there was a pause, and then he'd say one sentence that made everyone laugh, and then he'd go back to being quiet, like he'd just done what needed doing and moved on. The colonel smiled. That sounds exactly right. I drove to my parents' house on a Friday evening. I hadn't called ahead. I brought the documents the colonel had let me photograph, the letter from the shoebox, and the watch. My mother was in the kitchen when I arrived. My father was watching television. My brother happened to be there for the weekend, which I hadn't known and which felt, in retrospect, like the kind of coincidence that isn't really a coincidence. I put everything on the kitchen table. My mother started with the same position she'd held all week. She crossed her arms and said she thought I was building a story around things I wanted to believe. She said her father had been a complicated man and that complicated people sometimes left behind enough fragments that you could arrange them into almost anything. I slid the letter across the table. She picked it up. She read it once. Then she read it again. The second time through, her hands changed. Not dramatically, just a slight shifting of tension in her fingers, the way a person's body sometimes tells the truth before their face decides to. My father came in from the other room. He read the letter over her shoulder. He didn't say anything for a long time. I thought he just didn't want to be around us, my mother said finally. Her voice had lost the careful management quality. It sounded scraped clean. I thought we weren't enough for him, that we bored him or embarrassed him or something. He wasn't allowed, I said. The distance wasn't disinterest. It was protection. He should have found a way to tell me, she said. He couldn't, I said. And I think part of him believed that you would know, somehow. That you would trust him even without the explanation. I paused. He was wrong about that, but it wasn't because he didn't love you. My mother sat down. It was the quiet sitting down of someone whose legs have made a decision before their mind caught up. My father stood in the doorway with his hand on the frame. I called him difficult, she said. She wasn't talking to any of us. She was just saying it. For years, I called him difficult. My father said very quietly, I never called him. Not once in the last 2 years. I kept thinking I'd do it when I had more time. My brother was looking at his phone. Then he put his phone face down on the table, which for him was significant. He asked me once if I wanted to go fishing, he said. I said I was busy. It was a Saturday. He stopped. I was watching a game. Nobody spoke for a while. The kitchen was the same kitchen it had always been. The same table, the same yellow light from the overhead fixture my mother had been meaning to replace for years. But it felt different, like a room that has been sitting closed for a long time and someone finally opened a window. I want to do something, my mother said eventually. I don't know what, but I want to do something right. We held a second service 2 weeks later. Not a military ceremony, because we didn't want to make claims that weren't ours to make. Just a gathering at the small cemetery in Cookville where my grandfather was buried. We invited his neighbors, the people from his church, a few men from the VFW post who had known him in the way that veterans sometimes know each other without ever asking questions. Colonel Aldrich came. He stood at the back in civilian clothes and didn't introduce himself to anyone except me. There were no formal speeches. Instead, people simply talked. His neighbor from across the street talked about the winter he'd shoveled her walk without being asked, every single snowfall for 6 years. A woman from the church talked about how he'd quietly paid the heating bill for a family who'd been too ashamed to ask for help, and how she'd only found out by accident. One of the men from the VFW said my grandfather was the only person he'd ever met who could sit in complete silence with you for 2 hours and somehow make you feel like you'd had a conversation. My mother stood at the grave when the others were finished. She didn't prepare anything. She just stood there for a moment with her hands clasped together. I spent a long time thinking you owed me an explanation, she said. Her voice was steady but thin. I'm sorry it took me this long to understand that you were protecting me. I'm sorry I made you feel invisible. She stopped. You were never invisible to me. I just didn't know how to see you. The wind moved through the cedar trees at the edge of the cemetery. Nobody spoke. I stood there holding the watch, feeling its weight in my palm, and I thought about all the things my grandfather had carried that never showed on the outside. All the missions no one would record. All the lives quietly saved in places that officially didn't exist. All the holidays spent alone so that the people he loved wouldn't carry something they were never meant to carry. He hadn't needed the recognition. He had never asked for it. What he had wanted, I think, was simply to be seen by the people closest to him. Not as a hero, just as a man who had made choices and kept his word. We didn't give him that while he was alive. That was the truth my family was going to have to learn to hold. In the weeks that followed, things shifted in the small, non-cinematic way that real change usually works. My mother started asking questions about my grandfather's life that she had never asked before. Calling his old neighbors, talking to people at the VFW, slowly assembling a picture of a man she had lived beside for decades without fully looking at. My father went to Cookville one afternoon alone, he told me later, just to walk around the neighborhood where my grandfather had lived. He didn't explain why, and I didn't ask. My brother called me one evening, which was unusual. He said he'd been thinking about the fishing invitation. He said he'd been thinking about how many times he'd been too busy for things that turned out to matter. I don't know what to do with that, he said. I don't think you have to do anything with it, I told him. I think you just have to carry it. That doesn't sound great, he said. No, I agreed. It isn't. But I think that's what my grandfather had been trying to show us all along, without being able to say it directly. That some things can't be made right, that the weight doesn't go away, that you carry it, and you let it change how you move through the world, and you try not to make the same mistake twice. Colonel Aldrich sent me a letter a month after the service. He was stepping back from his public commitments, he said, but he had wanted me to know one more thing before he did. In the last year of my grandfather's life, one of the men he had extracted during an operation in 1971 had tracked him down through a veterans network. The man was in his 80s, living in Virginia, with children and grandchildren of his own. He had wanted to say thank you in person. My grandfather had agreed to meet him once. They had coffee at a diner in Cookville. My grandfather had not told anyone it was happening. He came home, the colonel wrote, knowing what he'd done had mattered. I think that was enough for him. He didn't need anyone else to know. I read that letter sitting on my own porch in the early morning, with coffee I'd made from scratch the way he'd taught me, and I held the watch in my hand and let myself feel the full weight of it. He had not died disappointed. That was what I had to understand. He had not spent his last years feeling like a failure. He had spent them exactly as he'd chosen to spend them, quietly, with integrity, leaving small things better than he'd found them, asking for nothing in return. The grief I felt was mine, not his. It was the grief of my family, for the years we'd wasted measuring a man by standards he had never agreed to be measured by. I still carry the watch. Not every day, but most days. When I take it out and turn it over and see that symbol on the back, I don't think about classified units or Cold War missions or things that officially never happened. I think about a man who shoveled a neighbor's walk in the snow without announcing it, who showed up when I was falling apart and made soup and drove home, who wrote careful letters in careful handwriting because someone he loved had mentioned missing mail. I think about what it means to do something real and not need anyone to know you did it. I think about all the people I pass through life without really looking at. The quiet ones, the ones who help without making a production of it, the ones who show up and do what needs doing and then step back. My grandfather was one of those people. He just happened to have spent part of his life doing it in places that didn't exist. And for a long time, my family looked at his silence and saw emptiness. I look at it now and see everything. If you're listening to this and you have someone in your life who is quiet in that particular way, who shows up without drama, who gives without inventory, who never explains themselves in the way that would make you appreciate them more easily, don't wait. Don't wait for a general to tell you who they are. Don't wait for a letter in a shoebox. Don't wait for a Tuesday morning in March when it's already too late. Ask them. Listen. Lean in. The greatest stories are often the ones that were never told out loud, and the people who carry them deserve to be seen while they're still here to know it. Thank you for being here. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you'd like more stories about quiet lives and the weight they carry, you're always welcome back.